Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're tackling something absolutely massive. It's one of the most profound questions in human history. When an empire is pushed to the absolute brink of destruction, what decides if it shatters into pieces or survives to see another era?
All right, let's take a quick look at our roadmap. We're going to cover empires on the brink, a house divided, the arrogance of tyrants, the war of production, absorbing the conqueror, and finally, the test of time. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Empires on the brink. The breaking point. You know, often the absolute biggest threat to a nation's existence doesn't actually come from across the ocean. It comes from within. I want you to imagine your entire world changing forever at exactly 4:30 in the morning, because that is exactly when the very first cannon boomed at Fort Sumter back in 1861. Up until that shot shattered the quiet of the dark harbor, people honestly thought this looming conflict was just going to be some quick little adventure. Literally, civilians brought picnic baskets to the first major battle. But man, that illusion was shattered real quick. The nation was literally tearing itself apart.
Now, years before the war even started, back in 1858, Abraham Lincoln actually saw this coming. He hit the nail on the head when he said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Think about Lincoln for a second. This is a guy born in a tiny dirt floor log cabin out in the wilderness who pretty much taught himself everything, and because he had that grounded, everyday perspective, he inherently understood a brutal truth. The United States just couldn't survive indefinitely, half free and half slave. That paradox, it was a ticking time bomb.
But we really need to ground all these grand political debates strictly in reality. 4 million. That's how many enslaved people were treated as literal property. 4 million. These were real people having their families ripped apart at auctions, risking their lives just for the chance to breathe free air. For them, you see, this wasn't about some abstract debate over states' rights. No, this was about seeking the absolute most basic human right to exist.
Moving on to Section 2, a house divided, the internal fracture.
By this point, America had basically become two totally different planets. It's like a giant puzzle where the pieces don't fit anymore. On one side, you've got the northern states. They're rapidly industrializing, building factories, and there's this growing abolitionist movement. But then, on the other side, the South had become entirely agrarian and, there's no other way to put it, hopelessly economically addicted to enslaved labor. And that addiction exploded right after the cotton gin was invented in 1793. These two halves of the country, they were completely incompatible.
Now, this kind of chaos doesn't just happen overnight, right? We can trace it from the compromises in 1819 to actual bloodshed in the streets of Kansas in 1854, all the way to the devastating Dred Scott decision. But look closely at 1860. The really bitter irony here is that when Abraham Lincoln actually won the presidency, his name wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states. Imagine that. For the South, that was the moment they felt they'd lost their voice entirely, making secession and the incredibly bloody war that followed pretty much inevitable.
And through all of this, Lincoln faced unimaginable personal grief. I mean, he literally watched his 11-year-old son, Willie, die of typhoid fever right there in the White House. But he kept moving forward. He bided his time for a crucial military victory at Antietam, which, by the way, remains the bloodiest single day in U.S. history. He used that very opening to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. In doing so, he gave the war an entirely new meaning. He was attempting to wash the nation of its original sin, ensuring that if it survived, it would survive as a new, truly free union.
All right, Section 3. The arrogance of tyrants. Overreach and collapse. Let's shift gears a bit. Nazi Germany's initial dominance relied entirely on something called the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. We're talking about a terrifying mechanical speed, fast-moving tanks, roaring planes, motorized divisions, all moving as one unstoppable unit. It was devastatingly effective. I mean, they crushed the supposedly mighty French army in just 6 weeks. But tragically, that rapid success, it totally fueled Adolf Hitler's fatal arrogance. He started believing his willpower alone could just bend reality. To really humanize the epic scale of the resistance against that sheer arrogance, we have to look up to the skies over Britain. Winston Churchill famously said, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." And he was talking about those young, utterly exhausted British RAF pilots. Some of these guys were flying up to 4 combat missions a single day. But they did it. They successfully denied Hitler control of the skies. And because Hitler couldn't break England, his bruised pride forced him into a disastrous pivot eastward. So Hitler expected Operation Barbarossa to be this swift 3-month victory lap. But the brutal reality? Well, his mechanical army crashed headfirst into the Rasputitsa, which is basically an endless, impassable sea of mud. And if that wasn't enough, then came the devastating negative 30 degrees Celsius winter. Hitler completely ignored logistics. He ignored the desperate pleas of his own generals, stubbornly ordering not one step back. And in doing so, he dug his own grave right there in the freezing Russian mud.
Section 4. The War of Production. Forging Victory.
At this point in the war, survival wasn't just being decided on those frozen battlefields anymore. It was being decided in the factories. Take the Lend-Lease program, for example. While Germany was desperately running out of oil, food, and steel to sustain its global war, American factories were running day and night. They provided massive industrial and military resources to the Allies without demanding immediate payment. It was this program that became the invisible, unyielding engine powering the entire Allied victory.
I mean, just look at the staggering scale of what the U.S. alone sent to the Soviet Union. We're talking 400,000 trucks, 14,000 aircraft, 7,000 tanks. It's absolutely mind-blowing. What this proves is that the Axis powers were simply starved of resources, choking on their own ambition, while the Allies coordinated an absolute industrial masterpiece that spanned across oceans.
And the clash on the Eastern Front, it was on a mind-numbing scale. Over 3.5 million German troops invaded. But here's the crazy part. Through slow, grinding endurance, Joseph Stalin somehow managed to dismantle and relocate over 1,500 entire factories safely behind the Ural Mountains, out in the snow, just to keep war production alive. It paid off, because by the time we get to the Battle of Kursk, the Red Army was able to deploy 1.3 million troops to permanently break the German war machine.
Okay, Section 5. Absorbing the conqueror, the ultimate survival mechanism.
Now let's look at a totally different survival method. But first, we need to understand their foundation. Let me introduce you to Zoroastrianism, the ancient Iranian religion. This belief system framed the entire universe as this uncompromising battle between light and dark. And fun fact, did you know ancient Iranians basically invented our modern concept of linear time? The idea that the world actually had a distinct beginning and is moving toward an ultimate conclusion. This profound worldview gave their civilization this incredible, unyielding moral unity.
And they needed that unity because Iran faced a jaw-dropping series of devastating invasions. Look at this. In 330 BC, Alexander the Great's Macedonians invaded. Then, in 651 AD, the Arab Caliphate swept in. And by 1220 AD, the ferocious Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan arrived and literally wiped out entire cities. Honestly, almost any other nation on Earth would have been permanently erased from the history books by these relentless, cataclysmic attacks.
But Iran's survival method? It is completely unique. They didn't secure their long-term survival with bows or tanks. Instead, it went like this. Invaders conquer by force, sure. But then, those invaders slowly start speaking the Persian language. And finally, they fully assimilate. Iran literally culturally digested its brutal conquerors. It's wild. Within just a few generations, these ruthless Mongol warriors were suddenly building beautiful blue-domed Persian mosques and funding local poets.
Which brings us to a really surprising and powerful fact. See, for centuries, the West called the country Persia, which kind of associated it with fairy tales and exotic carpets. But in 1935, Reza Shah officially demanded the world use its true ancient name, Iran, which means the land of the Aryans. It was a bold, incredibly defiant statement to the colonial world. They were saying, we're not some backward colony. We are a powerful, highly modern nation with ancient roots, and we demand respect.
And finally, Section 6, the test of time, the final crucible.
So, bringing it all together, it becomes incredibly clear that a nation's survival isn't just about the borders drawn on a map or the size of its weapons. it's so much deeper than that. It requires Lincoln's immense moral resilience to wash away a nation's original sin. It requires that staggering Soviet and American industrial endurance to simply outproduce tyranny. And it requires the unyielding cultural adaptability of Iran, surviving by literally absorbing the very forces meant to destroy it.
Which leaves us with a final, absolutely vital question to ponder. Looking back at the brutal tests history has thrown at us, what are the things we are divided on today? And more importantly, as we face our own modern crucibles, are we brave enough to find a way to stand together? History shows us it is definitely possible, but the choice of how we survive, well, that's always up to us. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.